Um, Hello, everyone. Okay, we'll be starting the session now. Good afternoon, everyone, and thank you for joining us for the eighth session of the Lectures in Planning series this fall with Professor Vinay Gidwani of the University of Minnesota. My name is Vinita. I'm a PhD student in urban planning at GSAP, and I will be moderating the session today. The lecture will happen for close to an hour, after which we'll have time for questions from the audience. I will be coordinating the Q&A with attention to diversity and inclusion. So to ask your question, please raise your hand and I will call you. Just to note that today's session will be recorded, so please keep that in mind. With that, we're very delighted to welcome our speaker for the day, Professor Vinay Gidwani, who's a professor in the Department of Geography, Environment and Society and the Institute for Global Studies at the University of Minnesota. His work navigates an uneven ideoscape consisting of Marxist geography, neoclassical economics, agrarian studies, and environmental science. He engages closely with disparate intellectual traditions, which often disagree on issues of epistemology and politics, which have been a source of creative tension. Although studying issues of work, poverty, livelihoods, and agroecological change within the Indian context, his scholarship is defined by research problematics rather than by regional affiliation. So it draws liberally on Africanist, Latin American, and Southeast Asian scholarship for insights. He's the author of the book Capital Interrupted, Agrarian Development and the Politics of Work in India, and co-editor of an upcoming book, Chronicles of a Global City, Speculative Lives and Unsettled Futures in Bangalore. So please join me in welcoming Professor Vinay Gidwani.
Thank you very much for that generous introduction. I'm really happy to be here. I especially want to thank the graduate students in the program in planning, and particularly Vinita, Diana, and Mauricio for inviting me to present this talk. I am not an urban planner, nor do I consider myself necessarily an urban studies scholar. I come at urban questions from an agrarian perspective. My training is in agrarian studies. So I think it allows me perhaps to think about urban questions, I hope, in a different way. So in today's talk, I may have gone a little bit overboard in that I am going to try out a new set of conceptualizations with you. And I'm hoping that since all of you are trained in urban planning, you probably have a much deeper grounding in urban studies than I do. You'll help me along and you'll prod me and you'll push me and you'll make me think in generative ways. So feel free to come at me with your questions. So what I want to do today really is to tell you a story. And I want to tell you a story about this place called Selampur, which, as the title slide says, is an electronic waste cluster or an electronic waste market in Delhi, India, right? And by some accounts, Selampur is the largest e-waste market in all of South Asia. And it is a remarkable story because it is almost entirely dominated by one ethnic community called the Maliks. They're a Muslim OBC community, and I'll briefly explain what the category OBCs stands for. But it's the Muslim Malik community that comes from a regional set of from villages and towns adjacent to Delhi in the state of Uttar Pradesh, approximately 50 to 80 kilometers away from Delhi. And they migrated to Delhi sometime in the 1960s, 1970s. The history is not sufficiently granular to be able to tell you exactly when. And this market takes shape. And what's really interesting about this e-waste market is how the Malik community has been able to leverage kinship networks of production and reproduction to really establish this market and sustain it over the many decades since it came into existence. So that's what makes it an interesting story. I have a suspicion that this is a story that is probably replicated in other parts of India, certainly, probably in other parts of the world. I know that, for instance, there are many other markets around where Selampur is located that also have a similar community characteristic, which is to say that the transactions and the traders in those markets tend to be from particular ethnic communities. So let me switch to the next slide. Oh, okay, perfect. Thanks. So this is the narrative arc of the talk. I'm going to begin with what are some of the popular depictions of Selampur in the media imagination, then kind of talk about the agrarian transformations that actually led to the establishment of this market. Then I'm going to give you some insights into this concept that I'm calling community economics. And this is where I'm being a little bit experimental, and I'm hoping you'll help me out. I'll give you some idea about the socio-spatial dynamics of this e-waste market. And then I'll make a very kind of speculative argument, essentially for a subaltern geography. And then I'll give you some sense of what is happening to the market right now. So this talk is based on research that was conducted with Akansha Jain. She's a PhD student at present at American University, and she did the bulk of the field work. This was in 2021, 2022, and then we did some follow-up research in the summer of 2024. So Selampur in the media imagination, right? These are commonplace, sort of plucked from the headlines, sort of depictions of Selampur. It's a place that is, right, presented as something with a spatial taint. I think Tom Slater, in his article with Loic Wacquant, albeit in the post-Fortis context, has described it as territorial stigmatization. There is a way in which this is a kind of place with a discrediting differentness, as Irving Goffman calls it, right? So basically, Selampur is seen as something that is really an anomaly that disrupts, right, the planning imagination. It's a place that is polluted. These are, the kinds of photographs that you might see about Selampur. It's certainly recognized as an electronic waste cluster, but it's seen as an electronic waste cluster where e-waste is dismantled in ways that are hazardous without proper safety protocols. It's presented as something that where e-waste is stored and repurposed in appalling conditions. It's also, because it's a Muslim-dominated neighborhood in Delhi, has also been the scene of recurrent communal riots. So it's also a place which, as recently as 2021, had scenes like this, right? If you plug Selampur into Google Maps, as I did, you come up with this cluster of red points on the map, which seems to suggest that it's actually sort of a fairly, right, dispersed neighborhood. In effect, what this is demonstrating is that Selampur has colloquially been identified with a different set of neighborhoods that lie east of the main river that runs through Delhi, which is the Yamuna River. And so it's basically called this coalition of neighborhoods that lie east of the Yamuna River. In fact, these neighborhoods are quite heterogeneous. They have very different socio-spatial histories of formation. And the Selampur that I am talking about is the solid red pointer there, this one, right, which lies right next to what used to be an irrigation canal in not so long ago, maybe about 60 years ago, right? So this was an area that was very much on the peripheries or fringes of Delhi and was an agricultural part of Delhi where the city was just beginning to encroach. By now, Selampur is, very much in the ambit of Delhi, and as I will suggest later in the talk, precisely because now it's been folded into the the boundaries of the city proper, a rent gap has emerged, and that has increasingly made the kinds of production activities and mercantile activities that used to go on in Selampur less and less viable, right? So what I want to do in this talk is really sort of get us away from the popular depictions of Selampur to show the rich history of placemaking that really informs and subtends this place. Now, this is the famous gully number 4, basically translates to lane number 4 or street number 4. And it's the widest street. This is on a Friday when the shops are closed. It's a Muslim neighborhood, right? And you can see why this is by far the sort of nerve center of the market, because it has a road that's wide enough to accommodate not just cars, but also trolleys and small trucks, right? Which can sort of bring in and take out the goods that circulate through this market. So you can see that is now known as the Shadra drain. It's now a sewage drain. What used to be not so long ago, a few decades ago, an irrigation canal is now a sewage drain. And as you can see, it's quite cluttered, right? But how did we get here? And in order to understand how we got here, we need to really kind of get a sense of the agrarian transitions that went on in the adjacent state of Uttar Pradesh, from where this Malik community eventually migrated to Delhi, right? So this is the state of Uttar Pradesh. This is just a political map with all the districts in Uttar Pradesh. It's the most populous state in India, as many of you will know. And this is Delhi right here on the western edge of Uttar Pradesh. And I just want to point out that all the Malik community hails essentially from this area, the green and the purple, right? From Meerut and Muzaffarnagar. That's the kind of catchment area from where this Malik community that migrated to Selampur and set up the market really hails. So it's reasonably close. Traffic is bad, so it still takes about 2.5 hours to get to these places. But it's definitely doable. And as we'll see, not just doable, it's something that these traders engage in all the time. In fact, one of the very interesting aspects of this market is that these traders, despite being in Selampur for now over 5 decades, maintain translocal households, right? In many cases, commuting daily, although not. And you can see that's just a kind of river map of Uttar Pradesh, and I wanted to put that up because Western Uttar Pradesh in particular has been historically one of the most fertile landscapes in India, which has been justly famous for its agricultural productivity, right? So what happened, right? Why did these Maliks move from this fertile agricultural landscape to the fringes of Delhi? Well, in order to understand what happened, we need to understand that the Maliks hail from this economically and socially backward community that the government of India has categorized as OBCs, right? Other backward classes, but basically a designator that tries to plan for affirmative action for communities that are seen as economically behind. OBC Muslims in the state of Uttar Pradesh, remember it's the most populous state in India, are 13% of the state's population, 24% of the state's OBC population, so they're Hindu and Muslim OBCs, and 69% of the state's Muslim population, which means the bulk of the Muslim population in Uttar Pradesh is categorized as OBCs, right? And this is from the, the National Sample Survey Organization, NSSO 68th round, which was conducted between 2011 and 2012. So this data is a bit dated, but this is really sort of the most recent granular data that I'm able to give you. So OBC Muslims consist of many subcastes who were traditionally landless laborers, in some cases marginal or small landholders, and in other cases involved in various forms of artisanal work, including oil extraction, carpentry, metallurgy, pottery, weaving, dairying, butchery, leatherworks, haircutting, and even the manufacturing of illicit liquor. Hindu OBCs, right, the Hindu backward communities in this part of Uttar Pradesh were famously called by the political scientists Lloyd and Susan Rudolph in 1987 as bullock capitalists, right? Which is to say that they were bullock capitalists because they gained from the land reform process that was implemented post 1947 in Uttar Pradesh. It was very unevenly implemented, but they gained, they saw their land holdings rise from 6% pre-1947 to about 20% post-1947. What's notable, however, is that Muslim OBCs did not experience similar gains. They remained, even in that rural context, fairly land poor, right? And this shows up in the data. So Hindu OBCs, even now, right, at least as going back to the 2012 data, are occupationally concentrated in farming. So 65% of them are in farming, whereas the comparable share for Muslim OBCs was 26%. That's a pretty sharp divide. So there are two trends that I want to kind of highlight among these Muslim OBCs, which is that most Muslim OBCs in Uttar Pradesh by 2012 were in urban occupations, either what is categorized as self-employed or as casual laborers, right? Now, however, when we compare the data from 2005 and 2012, we see some somewhat worrying trends. One is something that really started in the 1960s and 70s and which has continued apace, which is the growing urbanization of livelihoods, right? So the share of Muslim OBCs in farming fell from 38% to 26% in the span of these 7 years, which is, a fairly sort of sharp decline. The second is rising pauperization, right? So what was previously sort of called non-agricultural self-employment or non-farm self-employment, which is to say perhaps you're involved in forms of trading or individual entrepreneurship, declined from 39 to 32%, but more starkly, involvement in casual non-agricultural employment, which is to say casual labor, rose from 7% to 20%, right? So that's a pretty sharp increase, and it suggests that there is this kind of rising pauperization of this population. And not just that, it's not just that there is this kind of growing number of Muslim OBCs who are going into forms of casual work, manual employment, but the kind of urban employment that they were going into was low quality, right? And this has been noted by many economists and policymakers as well, but Muslim OBCs are found in low-end service trades with uncertain incomes like masonry, cycle repairing, tea shops, carpentry, barbers, street vending, tailoring, garment work, informal transportation, and so on. So just to kind of bring this to a close and to summarize this agrarian transition that occurred, the post-1947 or post-independence land reforms in India and the land consolidation programs that were unevenly implemented basically advantaged Hindu backward communities, but not Muslim backward communities. Muslim backward communities were essentially always land poor and supplementing their land-based incomes with various forms of manual work, from farm labor to artisanal production, but also because of the declining viability of the smallholder agriculture, provincial urbanization, which is to say the move from villages to regional towns and cities for work, set in earlier among Muslim OBC communities than their Hindu counterparts. Now, because these Muslim OBC communities and in general Muslim communities encounter all forms of structural discrimination, there has been a tendency for these communities to form, right, what are called minority enclaves. This is actually a term that comes from Wilson and Alejandro Portes back in 1980, right? They're talking about Cuban emigres to the US and how they end up in these minority enclaves, which can be leveraged for economic advantage. But basically, in India, this appears to be a way of trying to at least offset or overcome the systematic disadvantages and structures of discrimination in the market economy that Muslims face. And as a consequence, Muslim OBCs are sorted, right, like Dalits, but perhaps not to the same degree, are sorted into work graded by skill, security, danger, and toxicity in these caste-related or caste-like ways, where there's kind of an ontological association between the matter that you handle and your social status, right? And we see with the Malik community particularly in Selampur, but also other Muslim communities elsewhere, that they were able to leverage, right, this kind of community relationships into a form of economic advantage, but it's also something that then ends up producing urban segregation and the kind of territorial stigmatization in the built environment that I was talking about. But the process clearly differs from the way it's happened, for instance, with ghettos in the United States. So Muslim OBC communities have often carved out niches, right, in activities that either one, involved unskilled manual labor, or skilled labor that is labor intensive and handed down through systems of apprenticeship, or deal with the kinds of polluting materials that are ordinarily shunned by Hindu caste groups. And what I want to say is that this migration, right, from agrarian origins to a city like Delhi, a metropolis like Delhi, did not happen instantly. It wasn't a kind of immediate migration, but rather it took the form of a step migration where initially these communities appear to have migrated to provincial towns, such as this. This is the town of Shamli in Western Uttar Pradesh. It's a large market town and sub-district headquarter. The other thing I want to point out is that these economically disadvantaged communities, and this is a more general remark and perhaps a little bit speculative, is that they often depend on urban commons as a way of gaining their initial toehold in cities. And when I say urban commons, I mean that they go into activities, right, like street vending, like maybe barbering, or maybe like waste picking, right, which is something that I've studied fairly intensively, partly because barriers to entry into these activities are small, the overhead costs of setting yourself up in these activities are small, and they rely on what we might call quasi-common resources. So waste picking relies on garbage, which is in law the property of the municipal corporation, but in fact it's a quasi-commons that has been historically used to establish these kinds of informal waste picking economies. By the same token, street vending, right? It essentially relies on setting up a business using pavements or using roadsides as a kind of quasi-common space in order to get started in the livelihood. The second thing that I want to point out, right, which is that this is again sort of a more general remark that it's certainly very acutely true of the Maliks, but with a lot of migrants, they continue to maintain what we might call an agrarian or provincial orientation, right? So in a kind of more phenomenological sense, they continue to anchor or continue to sort of exist as these between beings, where there are very strong connections that continue to be maintained with their rural areas and places of origin. So how did these Maliks gain a toehold in cities? Well, it appears to have happened in the early 1970s. And Haji Salman Malik is one person that we interviewed. He came to Selampur in 1981. He was 15 years old, and he remembers it was just like a village. People reared buffaloes, they sold milk. There were maybe 5 or 10 Maliks in Selampur back then, all of whom were in waste work, right? So essentially, they were trying to make a living by recycling salvageables from urban garbage, right? And in the 1970s, urban garbage, items of value in urban garbage essentially consisted of paper, of glass, and to some extent, metals, right? Plastics were not a thing at the time. By now, the waste economy has changed drastically the world over because of the ubiquitousness of plastics, and plastics are now usually the largest kind of component of garbage. But e-waste is also running a close second. It's one of the fastest growing waste streams in urban garbage. So initially, there were about 5 shops, and these people employed what are called periwalas, essentially sort of these peddlers who would go around trying to find these items. They would bring them back to these shop owners who essentially also functioned as scrap dealers, who would then sort of segregate these items and sell them on up the value chain, right? So initially from garbage, by about the early 1980s, a critical mass of Maliks engaged in a process of market making and discovered, you know what? There is actually perhaps more value to be gleaned from metal and electrical scrap as opposed to the household garbage that they were dealing with, right? So there was a kind of process of experimentation where they were able to identify this as something that was more valuable and which they could establish a kind of niche in. So let me get into some of the more sort of the scholarship that exists on caste and ethnicity and basically the role of community in market formation. And at least the Indian scholarship on market formation and communities is pretty robust, right? We don't have to get into the details of this now. I'm happy to get into these details in the Q&A if you wish. But effectively, there have been studies of communities and how communities have been able, right, to leverage certain networks of social relations in order to really kind of gain a foothold in particular sectors, in particular kinds of markets. With the Maliks, right, the way the kind of event, if you want to call it, that really sort of impelled and pushed them right towards first provincial towns and cities and then to places like Delhi, was this case of what somebody might call primitive accumulation, or my colleague David Harvey might call accumulation by dispossession. But basically, the Maliks used to be also known in the vernacular as the Teli community. And the word Teli really translates literally into oil pressers. That was their traditional occupation, right? And they had these wooden crushers that were for historically the kind of basis of their livelihoods. But what really kind of displaced them was the arrival of these metal crushers for oil pressing sometime in the 1950s, right? And there's another trading community known as Banyas or Marwadis, who are really kind of a diasporic community spread all across India, who also were operating in Western Uttar Pradesh, which was the territorial expanse that the Maliks inhabited. They were traditionally grocers and money lenders in these villages. But what they did was they engaged, right, in this form of vertical integration by investing in this new metal, in these new metal crushers. And instead of purchasing oil that was pressed by the Malik Telis, they now set up their own crushers. And basically, because these crushers were more efficient, more cost effective, the Malik community was essentially pushed out, right, of its traditional occupation. So there was this original kind of act of dispossession that led to their migration. So by about the 1990s, after approximately 2 decades of dealing in mixed scrap, and later, as I've already mentioned, specializing in metal and electrical scrap, Selampur's Maliks began their transition to their current specialization in electronic waste. And once again, what I want to sort of bring across here in telling you the story is really the kind of experimentation that goes on in many of these communities, right? There's a certain kind of virtuosity. You want to call it entrepreneurship. You can call it entrepreneurship if you wish, but there is always kind of this way to try and find opportunity in what is presented to you to make the best you can of the constraints that confront you, right? And this movement into electronic waste is an example, right, of something like that. So let me just, right, briefly kind of narrate to you a short oral history, right? So Ali Baksh belongs to one of the oldest families in Selampur, and he remembers that when he first came, there were farms where Selampur now stands, owned by another pastoral community known as Gujars. And he says there was a sewage drain that used to be a canal for irrigating the fields. And when I was 5 years old, there was little water in it, but it was not so black in color. Now it's a sewage drain, so it's quite polluted. So as a child growing up in Selampur, he witnessed firsthand its transformation from this agrarian tract to a commercial market. His first memories date back to the early 90s, where he says there were 4 or 5 scrap shops dealing primarily in metal. And the earliest items that were traded, he remembers, included refrigerators, electrical transformers, coolers, ceiling fans, transistor radios, tape recorders, landline phones, and rubberized wires. Over time, this then evolved into a specialized electronic waste market that presently exists, trading mainly in computer parts, television sets, cathode ray tubes, CRTs, mobile phones, X-ray films, copper wires, and white goods, which include things like refrigerators, air conditioners, washers and dryers, heaters and microwaves, right? All the kinds of consumer durables that became more widely adopted after the 1990s. The highest value items are the ones with the most volume of metal components, and the lowest value are plastics and cardboard and batteries. So on being asked how this e-waste business grew popular in the community, one of the traders we talked to said, "Her chal hai aur kuch nahi," right? Which literally translates into it's nothing but herd mentality. Now, on the way, it's a kind of throwaway comment, but it actually obscures what was really kind of going on here, right? This casual remark I want to suggest disguises the toil and imagination, right, that these Malik traders had to employ in order to actually glimpse this market niche that they could capitalize on. And they realized early, right, the prospective value that could be generated from materials that are found in these discarded electronic items. And not just that, they were then able to kind of utilize their extensive kin networks to identify sources of e-waste as well as markets that were salvaged from this detritus, right? So what I want to say here is that not only did they glimpse, right, they had to actually make a market for it. And how did they make the market? They basically leveraged their kin networks because they had to establish a supply chain which would bring them a regular supply of electronic waste that could then be dismantled for all these valuable items. And they did this through these kinfolk who were sent out around the country to establish these outposts where they would go and locate, right, these troughs of electronic waste that somebody was essentially auctioning off or selling off, and then transport those back to Delhi and engage in this, really vibrant dismantling operation. So it was a kind of bandwagon effect, but it's the kind of bandwagon effect that, captures what economic geographers have called agglomeration economies and the kinds of increasing returns to scale that can arise as a market becomes thicker with growing numbers of buyers and sellers. So, it's obvious that in some ways, this argument I'm making about how the Malik community was able to leverage skin networks, right, has resonances with Bourdieu's concept, Pierre Bourdieu's concept of social capital, right? And I'll just sort of point you to this excerpted text in the black, right, which is how membership in a group, right, can be leveraged to create, right, this kind of credentialization that entitles members of this community to credit in various senses of the word, right? Essentially, Bourdieu's idea is also that social capital, these kinds of durable networks that can be leveraged, is also has the characteristic of being fungible because it can lead to economic capital in all kinds of ways. So I want to give credit where it's due, but I also want to sort of more speculatively try to extend Bourdieu's concept of social capital through my concept of community economics. I'm not wedded to this term. In fact, I feel a little bit, I don't quite like the term. But nevertheless, for the purposes of this talk, it captures, I think, what I'm trying to get at, which are these three attributes. Firstly, right, these aspects of group relations and community fungibility that enables a geographic shift from one to another distinct economic space, right? In this case, from these rural areas, provincial towns in Western Uttar Pradesh to this market in Delhi. The second is the physical placemaking that sustains the consolidation of this new economic niche, a process of market making, as I've emphasized, while reinventing the habitudinal schemes of an inhabited, inherited place world, right? So here I'm drawing on the um, phenomenologist Edward Casey, whose work I find actually quite interesting to think with because he's also in some ways Bourdieuian, right? And so this is a kind of organic extension, I guess, of Bourdieu's thought. And the third aspect is how the social and cultural repertoires of this place world are leveraged to build out, on the one hand, these production networks and value chains, but also crucially, something that I feel is missing, right, in this notion of social capital is crucially to harness circuits of care and social reproduction, the kind of invisible work of gendered work of care that actually sort of sustains the petty capitalist enterprises in a place like Selampur. And for those of you who are, more familiar with Bourdieu's concept of social capital, and you're seeing sort of resonances. There are also resonances here with Karl Polanyi's idea of, how the social embeddedness of markets and how, right, transactions can be this shifting mix of reciprocity, redistribution, and exchange. But I really sort of want to point to the unremunerated care and social reproductive work of Malik women and girls in kind of underbedding the production activities that go on in this um, market. So, one can think of this another way as this dialectic of culture and economy. And the idea being that there's a range of political and economic advantages that accrue from these place-based community membership and kin relations, which Sylvia Yanagisako, an anthropologist at Stanford, has called, right, this complex of emotional orientations and embodied dispositions that can lead to all these kinds of gains. Now, this is a bit of a laundry list here, so I don't want to sort of read it out word by word, but I'm happy to sort of come back to this in the Q&A. But let me just sort of briefly, right, point out that one of the ways in which, right, these social networks become particularly important is as a pathway for entry for younger Maliks who are looking to establish a place in their lives, right? And so what these social networks do is really offer a kind of pathway of apprenticeship um, and an entry point into like learning the street skills that are necessary for being a successful trader in the e-waste world, right? And so younger Maliks not only get this kind of apprenticeship, they may also benefit from credit that is extended to them by uncles or fathers or other male members who are in the business. They may also be sent out initially on a trial basis to these various outposts across India to try and insert themselves into the mercantile relationships that sustain the supply chains. So there's a whole set of ways in which this kind of uh, embodied place world of Maliks can have economic advantages. So let me turn to the sociospatial dynamics, right, of this economy in this market in Selampur. So what is called, right, mal, which is literally sort of the stuff that they will then dismantle or repurpose or recycle, arrives through a range of sources. 69% of the traders in this market told us that they essentially sort of engage in intra-market trade. So the Selampur, by our count, has about maybe 350 shops, and we surveyed a third of them. So we think that these are generally kind of accurate, and it's a dense enough place. It's a pretty large market that intra-market trade can, sustain many of these traders. 38% of the operators in this market employ these peddlers who go in search, right, of e-waste, and then some of them purchased from aggregators and auctions in other cities. Um, a very large portion of traders, as I said, belong to the Malik community, close to 84%. They're also very minority sort of representations of other Muslim communities. There's only one Hindu trader in the entire market. 53% of Maliks belong to this place called Meerut, or the catchment area of Meerut, which is a provincial city in Uttar Pradesh, 22% to Muzaffarnagar, and so on. Again, the general point here is that they come from this very defined catchment in the state that's adjacent to Delhi. And 46% of traders reported that they inherited the business from a family member, whereas the rest leveraged community resources to enter the market. This is one of the more fascinating aspects of the market in Selampur, which is that translocal households are the norm, right? So 62% of Selampur's traders basically have migrated to Delhi without their families, and who continue to reside in these provincial locales. And these traders live in rented accommodation, and they travel back to their village every Thursday evening to be with their family until Saturday or Sunday morning. An additional 7% commute daily from villages, and only about 30% of traders have relocated to Delhi with all their family. So it's really interesting. Over all these decades, over this kind of intergenerational reproduction of the market, these traders nevertheless retain this very strong bond to their rural provincial places. So let me come to, I guess, the really speculative portion of my talk, right? And what I want to sort of first show you is, right, this kind of territorial production complex, another term that economic geographers use, but this kind of territorial production complex that has ramified, right, around Selampur. And each of these places that is labeled on this not very good map essentially kind of has a functional division of labor, right, where different components from the e-waste go to these different places for more specialized processing. I won't go into the details, but suffice to say, there is this kind of ramified complex that exists around Selampur. But what I want to really sort of propose, right, borrowing from the work of Solomon Benjamin, who wrote this wonderful thesis back in 1995 at MIT in urban planning, where he studied a neighborhood close to Selampur called Vishwasnagar. And Solomon Benjamin's thesis was that, Vishwasnagar had to be understood as this neighborhood factory. He called them sort of neighborhoods as factories. And what I want to propose is that places like Selampur are, again, sort of akin to these neighborhoods as factories, but also they're metabolic nodes where pathways of people, objects, information, money combine in all these different ways to enable this petty capitalist accumulation, right? With value generated through trading, mercantile capital, through processing, industrial capital, but also increasingly through rentier forms of capital, right? Where land has become much more expensive and valuable, and generating rents is now being a landlord actually can be more lucrative than being a trader. The second is, I want to say that the urban experience, the certitudes of urban life itself, and the viability of its socio-spatial processes, right, hinges on this reversal, continuous whittling away of what William Viney has called the chronography of things, right? When things become disposable, they move from the domain of use time to what he calls waste time. But places like Selampur and many other hubs like it are vital to reinvesting objects with new functions and new social use values. And finally, right, to borrow from Edgar Peterse, while considered residual in the urban imagination, places like Selampur, I would suggest, allow us to trace this kind of counter topography or a shadow topography, what I will very guardedly term a subaltern geography, comprising this sort of active lattice work of flows and relations that are more than the city, right? They are not sort of centered just in the city, and are always in some ways, right, evasive, which is to say there's always such a kind of dynamism and such an obscuring of these relations that it's not always possible to map these in full. So where is Selampur now, right? And this is my final slide. You've been most patient, right? Is that Selampur's success, as I've argued, is built on community economics, which is a concept where I try to kind of capture the essential workings of this ramified and reinvented place world or habitus that has been leveraged into these economically profitable ways for capital accumulation. At the same time, macroeconomic interventions, policy changes undertaken by the Indian government, particularly after 2016, including demonetization, the imposition of general services tax, and COVID lockdowns have weakened the supply chains, the kind of interstate trade networks that nourish and sustain a place like Selampur. Spatial diversification may be one kind of survival route. So Selampur has definitely begun to dissipate, right, as an e-waste hub. And there's evidence that many of the functions that used to be performed in Selampur have now kind of been shifted to other parts, sometimes in parts that are where rents are lower, where the gaze of the Pollution Control Board is less intense. Scrutiny is less from authorities. So there's mounting evidence of, right, the off-bordering, particularly of dismantling processes or transformation processes that are considered sort of more toxic. So that's where matters stand. And I'm just going to end with this note of thanks, and I'm open to questions, suggestions, criticisms, what have you. So thank you. Don't be shy.
Thank you so much. Starting off with I know any place is
bring up that slide since I glossed over it. Lots of slides, didn't I? This one. And that one, um, this. How
last